Let's quickly bring in my guest right now, Omotola Abimbola, who is the Assistant Vice President, Chapel Hill, Denham. Hello, Abimbola, and welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. It's my pleasure to be here.
Inflation out of control. 4 years, 4 years
hmm
high. Where do we go from here? Was this the figure you were expecting?
That's a very nice summary that you put there. Inflation is essentially going out of control. And in terms of our own expectation for the figures that came out earlier today, I think one key thing we have to note is that we have been seeing some negative inflation surprises of recent. That is inflation, if actual inflation prints being higher than analyst projection. And what we saw for the March CPI figure was no different. Analysts were expecting the number to be between 17.6% to 17.9%, but it came in much more substantially higher at 18.17%. Essentially, showing that we are still having consistent negative inflation surprise for Nigeria.
How serious is this problem? Because if we're talking about, it's a developing story. March inflation released at 8:30 a.m. In case people are wondering what we're discussing, let me just reiterate it again, that what we're discussing, we're as live as we can be. We are analyzing the numbers that just came out by the National Bureau of Statistics at 8:30 a.m. So we should put that on the screen, developing story. So we're trying to have that first word so that Nigerians can understand what we're talking about. These are numbers that just came out a few hours ago, about 2 hours ago. How serious is this problem, Omotola? How serious is this? Because when we're talking numbers like this, it's as if it doesn't make sense. Can you break it
Indeed,
down?
indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. It is quite serious. And why do I say so? The current inflation print that we have is at the highest level that we have had in slightly more than 4 years. And if you look at the actual drivers of the figure, looking at it from the core inflation and the food inflation, the major pressure point for the headline inflation still remains the food inflation. And food is very, very important because if you look at Nigerian household spending, the average Nigerian spends roughly 56%, of his or her income on food prices. So when you are having food prices surging at the rates that we are currently witnessing, it portends a problem and it could have so much social implications. But speaking further, on the drivers between the food and the core, food deflation specifically, jumps by well over 100 basis points to the highest that we have seen in more than 15 years, which is 23%. On the other hand, core inflation was a little bit more benign. It only rose to around a 3-year high figure of 12.7%. So food still remains the key pressure point for inflation. And for a country like Nigeria, for a low middle income country like Nigeria, where the average citizen spends a disproportionate portion of his or her income on food inflation, it even makes it, much more worse. Essentially, inflation is a massive tax on the poor. And if the poor are even spending more on food, it even makes it a lot more worse than we think.
How dangerous is this inflation? Because this inflation is not due to monetary factors. So how dangerous is this kind of inflation? Because if it's not due to monetary factors, that means that there is a level at which the apex bank, which is the Central Bank of Nigeria, can control it.
So I would say that it is due to a multitude of factors, particularly when you look at food inflation. For instance, the recent uptick in food inflation has an international dimension because globally food prices are rising. If you look at the broad basket, of food prices measured by the Food and Agricultural Organization's food index, FAO's food index, it is up by roughly 25% on a year-on-year basis, and is at the highest level that we have seen since 2014. So generally, internationally, food prices are rising due to the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic that we had last year had a severe impact, on supply chains, and we also saw a significant uptick in demand for food. Caused by massive fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus deployed by several countries. Also, the fact that we saw aggressive buying, in China. So if you look at the international basket for food, things like grains such as maize, soya bean, ECC, they are all trading, as close to multi-year high. So definitely there is a massive there is an international dimension to the food price pressure that we are witnessing. And if you look at Nigeria's neighboring countries, both in both the Francophone West African region, to even the Anglophone countries like Ghana, and if you look at the larger emerging markets, they are all currently, seeing food inflation above trend level. So certainly there is a global there's a global food shortage currently, having a price impact. But one thing we also have to note is that none of these countries I mentioned, have food inflation at over 20%. So there's a lot of local factors also at play here. And three comes to mind. The first one is the Hill time border closure, policy that came into being in 2019, which was a security operation to limit the level, smuggling and to protect the Nigerian farmers. So I think the timing of that border closure perhaps didn't come at the best time. That's the first factor. The second thing also is that, during the COVID-19 pandemic last year, we didn't see enough planting activity during the planting season, partly because migrant labor, which the Nigerian farmers typically rely on, particularly in major food producing regions in the north. They couldn't come in due to the border closure. So COVID-19 pandemic also had an impact, on the planting season, which we have now started seeing the impact, since the harvest season started. And I think the third factor I would mention is that we've also, see a bit of protectionist policy coming from the central bank that has led to, much more, higher imported food inflation. So, for instance, last year we saw the central bank at some point limiting access to FX for you to import grains. We also saw we also saw very very tight level of liquidity in the official FX market, which drove a number of people, particularly importers, into the parallel market. And of course, we saw, a widening of the parallel market spread and an aggressive depreciation of exchanges in the parallel market. So all these things are having an impact, on food inflation. And I think we also have what I would describe as structural challenges also affecting food inflation. So, for instance, the issues of insecurity in major food producing regions, it's a structural issue that is not under the purview of monetary policy. So, for instance, but be that as it may, I haven't mentioned the supply side structural issues affecting food inflation and general headline inflation. I still think there is a very prudent argument to actually make that the current inflationary pressure that we are witnessing also has some demand side some demand side drivers. So, for instance, if you look at Nigeria's monetary aggregate data, right, you would notice that we have been seeing a sporadic growth in domestic credit over the last 2 years. 2 years ago, we saw domestic credits grow by over 17%. Same thing last year. So when you are having, a very massive credit stimulus in your economy, naturally that should fuel inflationary pressures. And if you actually dig deeper to understand why we are having such an explosive growth in domestic credit, it's mainly led by the government, right? The government, because of the revenue challenges and the need for them to spend more money to stimulate the economy, they have
Omotola,
been on a borrowing
just
binge.
hold on a bit. Omotola, just hold on a bit and let me understand your last statement. Are you saying that domestic credit in the economy is growing and that's why it's also impacting the inflation we're seeing? I didn't get that part well.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So the central bank's position has always been that, supply side challenges, they are the major drivers of inflation in Nigeria. They are not wrong. Supply side challenges have been, they've become exacerbated of recent, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that there are some other demand side pressures that are coming, from the credit policy of the central bank. So anytime you have an aggressive, increase in credits, particularly by the government, right, it typically generates inflationary impacts, and that is shown in the M2 money supply growth. Last year, Nigeria's M2 grew by over 30% year on year, right? So, one I'd acknowledge the fact that we have supply side issues weighing on inflation in Nigeria. I also think that there are some demand side issues that we can also fix by having a much more appropriate, monetary policy framework.
So from your own analysis, are you saying as a result that the inflation we're seeing is as a result of the failure of monetary policy?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say it is failure of monetary policy alone. Like I said, we have some age-long structural issues, facing Nigeria, from poor infrastructure to having largely rain-fed agriculture, to smallholder farming mechanism, to low productivity in the agricultural sector. So these are age-long structural challenges that have kept inflation rates high in Nigeria. In fact, I tell people that Nigeria is not a low inflation country. Don't let us deceive ourselves. If you look at the long-term trend of inflation in Nigeria, look at the 20-year average of inflation. It's double digits, it's 12%. Look at the 10-year average, it's 12%. So low inflation in Nigeria, single-digit inflation in Nigeria is not the norm. It is an anomaly. Typically, we're a double-digit inflation country, right? Because of the largely structural challenges that we have in the country. But be that as it may, we also have to acknowledge the fact that there could be some cyclical demand side issues that have even made the current price shock even much more. And that's why I said that we have to investigate monetary aggregate data and see where we can improve on. And like I mentioned, credit to the federal government, it's been ballooning of recent. In 2019, credit to the government went up by 95% because government was aggressively borrowing, either through deficit financing by the central bank, monetization of debt by the central bank, or even via the financial market. So I think after COVID-19, after we've been able to restore growth, back to the positive territory, there's a need for the fiscal authorities and monetary authorities to sit down to actually look at where things could improve. For instance, I think you start seeing, much more revenue-based fiscal consolidation by the federal government, so that we can reduce, this issue of deficit monetization that has created so much money supply, in the economy. And also on the monetary hand as well, I think, the appropriate framework for now, particularly post-COVID, has to be that we need to see a much more tighter monetary policy framework to at least, reduce the level of credit growth in the economy and actually also reduce the pressures that we are seeing in the FX market.
So with what you're saying, are you canvassing for an interest rate adjustment perhaps at the next MPC meeting in May? Because of the skyrocketing inflation that we're seeing right now. And this figure we're seeing is a 4-year high. We're going back to inflation figures that we saw in 2016, just before we even got into a recession. And Nigeria's problem is so hydra-headed in the sense that we're not just struggling with inflation, we're struggling with stagflation, we're struggling with poverty, we're struggling with our macro environment is not too good, the investment climate is not too good. That was why I asked the question even earlier, that how dangerous is this path? Especially how dangerous is the skyrocketing inflation, bearing in mind that perhaps there are more structural factors. You said earlier, and I took that Nigeria is not a low inflation country. So are we going to be looking at the time whereby inflation will reduce to a single digit? Don't forget that we had single inflation even when Lamido Sanusi, the former Emir of Kano, was the central bank governor. So everything does scatter. How did we get here?
Firstly, if you look at the larger picture of things, we've been having so many negative data, publications of recent. Growth since the COVID-19, shock that we had, last year in March, we have seen, economic growth actually decelerate. We managed to exit recession in Q4 2020, but only marginally. And the growth outlook is still very suboptimal. So, by consensus expectation, growth over the next 3 to 4 years is still expected to be below the population growth rate of 2.7%. So that's the problem, from the growth angle. From the unemployment angle as well, the economy is not generating enough jobs or is being used. And we saw unemployment rates, reaching, a record high of 30%, last year. And then we also now have the issue of the aggressive increase in inflation rates, which which, like I mentioned earlier, is a massive tax on the poor. So in a country where you have the average consumer spending 56%, of his or her income, on food and food related, products. Anytime you see such a very aggressive increase in inflation, what will the consumer do? It's going to cut down on other essential things like healthcare, like transport, like feeding. So it's a massive problem, and that's why I really sympathize with the central bank, because they are juggling so many balls. On one hand, they want to stimulate the economy, and improve growth. They want the economy to create more jobs, to reduce the social stress that we are currently witnessing, and they also want to achieve relatively stable, consumer prices. So it's a lot of work for them to do, and that's why I would say that this is not a job for the central bank alone. It's a job that has to be, taken head on by the fiscal authorities as well.
So we
Through
need coordination there, fiscal and monetary policy.
exactly, we need structural reforms that will unleash growth in the economy. But regarding the outlook for monetary policy, as you initially, had, um, I wouldn't say I'm the only person calling for an increase, in monetary policy rate. If you look at the last monetary policy committee meeting, you would notice that, three out of the committee members, that voted at the meeting actually voted for a policy rate hike. They voted for between 50 basis points to 100 basis points increase in the benchmark monetary policy rates to, from the current level of 11.5% to either 12% or 12.5%. So I think, look at the monetary policy itself, monetary policy committee itself, I think their views are gradually changing. Last year, their focus was understandably pro-growth, because we had a massive growth shock, that was partly caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The monetary policy had to be very accommodative to support the economy. And to a very large extent, they have achieved, their objective. Nigeria managed, surprisingly, against the run of play, without anybody expecting it. Nigeria managed to escape recession, managed to exit recession rather in Q4 last year, thanks to the extraordinary dovish monetary policy of the central bank. So they've achieved that objective. Now their focus, which I suspect going forward, will be how to now reduce the current extraordinary, high level of consumer prices and bring it lower to around the 20-year average of 4%.
Omotola, if you're canvassing for a higher interest rate, don't you think that it would also stifle the lives of Nigerians? Because our incomes are already suppressed. And even the little incomes that we're earning, the little money that we have, more than 56% of it, or around 56% of it, goes to the purchase of food alone. Then the others goes to health, transport, and what else, education, and what have you. So if you're canvassing that perhaps the emperor should be increased at the May meeting, wouldn't it stifle? Because how much economic sense does it make that you have an economy that is not growing, an economy that just crawled out of recession, an economy that is suffering stagflation, an economy that investment environment is not good, an economy that is the poorest country in the world? So explain yourself. Convince me and convince Nigerians.
I'll be answering your question in so far. So having robust GDP growth is a very, very good thing, right? We also have to understand that having elevated inflationary pressures also is an extremely bad thing, right? That could be a massive tax on the poor, right? While the rich to a very large extent, who have savings, who have very large income, they will typically dip into their savings to actually, get by. But the poor cannot afford to do the same thing. So while it is very important to get parts of the positive territory, it's equally important, for addressing income inequality challenges, and to also ensure that, that we have, less social challenges. It's so equally important that we have, moderate inflationary pressure. So they are both very, very important. And The central bank's focus, if you look at their mandate, the monetary policy mandate, their mandate is to achieve price and exchange rate stability. That is their focus, right? Growth mandates can be solved in conjunction with the fiscal authorities through structural reforms that's going to enable or spur growth, in other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, such as industry, such as services, right? So the central bank alone cannot solve the growth challenge, but they can do a lot more to actually curb the current inflationary pressures. So on that front, I think there's a very potent argument to make, for a much more tighter monetary policy framework. And then the second argument I would make is that high inflation is also a huge tax on savings, right? So currently we have, headline inflation rates well above 18%, but the 1 year NTB rate, right? At the auction that we had yesterday, the 1 year NTB rates, cleared as 9%. So that is a massive, tax on the savings of Nigerians, right? Of pension fund contributors. So I mean, you and I contribute to pension funds, and so many Nigerians as well, numbering close to 10 million people, right? They have their RSA savings, and if we continue having extremely high inflation, it is going to affect their real return over the long term, and it would imply that, at the point, when they want to retire, right, their retirement savings may not be able to, cover for their basic needs alone. So this thing has to be looked at from so many perspectives, right? So that's why I think that, perhaps the best policy course of action back at the moment is to actually, test monetary policy a bit, to actually, reduce the pressure that we are facing in the foreign exchange market,
Okay.
and also regarding consumer prices. While we can have the two authorities working hand in hand with the central bank to solve the age-long structural issues that are limiting the growth outcome of Nigeria.
Omotola, Ramadan fast is ongoing right now. In a bit, we'll be taking the live market survey from our correspondent in the marketplace right now to see how Nigerians are feeling. In fact, when you were speaking, I got a tweet, and let me read the tweets quickly. The tweet is from Afolake Osazuwa, and she's saying that this is terribly unbearable. She called a product, okay, let me put it this way, that she original butter that she buys for 350 naira. I don't want to call the brand. The original butter that she buys for 350 naira is now 800 naira. I couldn't buy for my daughter. Omotola, are you there? Are you with me? She's saying that she couldn't buy it for her daughter yesterday. Does it mean one is going to die of hunger? For something that you were buying 350 naira, perhaps the previous month, now you're buying it for 800 naira. The Ramadan fast is ongoing. How unbearable will this inflation, food inflation especially, because we have core headline month on month and food inflation. Food inflation seems to be on an adrenaline. It's just going. There is no doctor that is, or the medicines that they are administering is not working. So how unbearable would this be, especially on Nigerians, within a fast period?
It's going to get worse before it gets better. That's my outlook regarding, Nigeria's inflation trajectory. And that's why, I mentioned initially that having positive GDP growth is a good thing, but having extremely high inflation rate is also a very, very bad thing. And like I said initially, high inflation is a tax on the poor. And when you see food inflation rise by more than a quarter, right? What then happens is that you see, the poor and middle income citizens actually cutting down on their purchases of very essential things like food, like healthcare, etc. So it's very, very important that we tackle the current, high inflation trajectory through a combination of both tight monetary policy on one hand, and also focusing much more importantly on the age-long structural issues that have, led Nigeria to become a high inflation country. So things like reducing Nigeria's reliance on rain-fed agriculture, things like reducing the level of price wage that we have. So if you look at Nigeria's food inflation as well, it's a story. you would notice that we have a price wedge problem. In some states, you have particular, food items, selling for half the price. They are selling in other parts of the country. So that's because of
What is your?
the supply chain issues,
Yeah, I can see
caused
it. Yeah,
by
I'm seeing it.
poor infrastructure, particularly, both rail and rail transport. So we need to invest a lot more in infrastructure to reduce price wedges.
I should do what?
We also need to, do
Okay.
some reforms in the
Just call the
structure,
student now. Just call now.
in the supply chain of the country, such that the middlemen, do not
This one,
take
this one, this one. Yes, yes, yes.
a proportionate portion of the income of farmers and lead to aggressive increase in prices. But regarding the outlook for inflation, like I said, it's going to get worse before it gets better.
How worse
in the
can
near
it get?
term-
What's your figure? If it's at 18.17% now, it's as worse as it can be.
Based
It's
on
as,
the,
what at, it's as worse as it can be. What is your figure? What is your worst figure?
the based on the current trajectory that we are in, I think it is very feasible to see headline inflation rate hitting 20% by Q2 to early Q3 2021. But I think it's going to get better as well in the second half of the year for various reasons. Number one, I think base effects will play a role. Last year we saw a very aggressive, increase in inflation, particularly in the second half of the year. And I think by the second half of 2021, base effects should start playing a role actually in moderating the year-on-year figures.
Okay.
Secondly, I also think that we are probably, getting to the tail end of the FX liquidity challenges that we are facing as a country. Thanks to the uptick that we have seen both in oil prices and production, and my expectation that the central bank will actually, tighten monetary policy going forward. So that should help to reduce the pressure that we are seeing in the FX market by the second half of this year. So I think to a very large extent, over the next term, possibly see 20% headline inflation rates in the second half of 2021. But I think in the second half of the year, perhaps towards Q4, we start seeing pressures actually subsiding, for headline inflation.
Okay, Omotola, I have two questions for you before we go. Let's take a look at the breakdown from states very quickly. If we take a look at the numbers that were released this morning, all items inflation year on year was highest in Kogi State at 24.5%, Bauchi 22.2%, Sokoto 20.7%, Imo 16.08%. For food inflation on a year-to-year basis was highest in Kogi. Did I say that earlier? Okay, Kogi is still there for all items and food. While food inflation was highest in Rivers, March, 3.52. On a year-on-year basis, it was highest in Kogi. So if you take a look at states, which states are better now for food inflation? Which states should we relocate to if we can get food cheaper from there, since this is what the data says? Whether I should leave Abuja and go to where else now? Zamfara recorded the slowest rise in month-on-month food inflation, while with Yobe and Kebbi recording price deflation.
That's not so surprising, and this points to, the issues I mentioned earlier about, about price wedges, being amongst the reasons why we have extremely high inflation in Nigeria. So because of poor transport infrastructure, right, we typically have uneven prices across the country. In some major, agrarian communities, we see food prices there being very, very low, particularly within the north central and the northwest part of the country. We see food prices being low there, and in the more industrial and services driven, part of the country, in the southern parts, we see food inflation particularly being very, and food prices generally being relatively higher, in that part of the country. So that points to the fact that one of the ways that we can, one of the ways we can solve the structural aspects of Nigeria's food inflation is actually to work on reducing the price wedges by investing more in infrastructure. I know we have seen a lot of investment in infrastructure recently, by the federal government. We have seen investment in rail infrastructure. We have seen investment, in transport infrastructure. in road transport infrastructure has grown. But I think we also need to see more. The scale of the problem is very, very massive.
Okay.
By some estimates, we need to see close to $100 billion of investment, in Nigeria's infrastructure for us to, curb, for us to reduce the gap, that we have between supply and demand.
Omotola, final question, and I would appreciate if you can answer this in less than a minute. How will these numbers that we're seeing right now in the inflation environment, the characteristics of this inflation that we're seeing right now, how do you think that it will affect equities, bonds, treasuries, Eurobond? We're going to borrow $3 billion from the Eurobond market. So putting all of this into perspective, how do you think it's going to impact all of this?
Okay, so I think it is bearish for the impact for naira assets, including equities and fixed income. So naturally, when you have extremely high inflation, expectation of tighter monetary policy going forward, and that's negative for fixed income in the sense that yields are going to rise, but prices will decline because of the inverse relationship between yield and prices. We should probably expect, further uptick, in fixed income yields because of the expectation that we're going to see a much more tight monetary policy going forward. And that's negative for equities as well in a way, because higher fixed income yields increases the risk-free risk in the economy, and we further, spur more domestic asset managers to reallocate their portfolio in favor of fixed income compared to equities. So it's bearish for local assets, but it is neutral for our Eurobond. Nigerian Eurobonds trade on different fundamentals. So the primary, the primary drivers are credit risk, right? As well as the global financing conditions. And on credit risk, I think Nigeria's credit risk over the near term is probably benign. We do not expect to see further credit downgrade for Nigeria. Perhaps we are probably even prime for a credit upgrade, because of the favorable commodity cycle for Nigeria.
Okay.
So that's neutral from that perspective.
All right, Omotola, thank you very much for joining us today. Omotola Abimbola is the Assistant Vice President, Chapel Hill Denham. Thank you. See you soon. I hope
Thank you.
when I see you again that it's not skyrocketing, but from your own analysis, it will climb further. Thank you, Omotola, for joining us.